Do you remember the first time someone told you that you were born guilty? Not for anything you did, for something that happened before you existed, before you opened your eyes, before you drew a breath. Guilty because, at the beginning of the world, in a garden you never saw, two people ate a piece of fruit. They had a name for it: original sin. And you believed them because you were a child, and they were the adults, and they said it came from God. But here is the strange thing they never had you notice. The very first threat in that whole story, the threat the entire idea of the fall depends on, never actually comes true. God tells Adam, "In the day you eat of that fruit, you will die." Adam eats. And then, by the Bible's own count, Adam goes on living for another 930 years. 930 years after being told he would die that day. In 1665, a man saw that gap and everything it implied, and could not look away from it. His name was Baruch Spinoza, and the reason we know what he thought about it is that a frightened believer wrote him a letter, begging for an explanation that would let him keep believing. The answer Spinoza gave did not defend the story. It took the guilt apart at the root. And to understand how, we have to start with the man who wrote the letter. His name was Willem van Blijenbergh, a grain merchant from the Dutch city of Dordrecht, an amateur theologian, and, by every sign in his letters, a sincere and anxious Calvinist who genuinely wanted the faith to make sense. In late 1664, Blijenbergh writes to Spinoza with a problem he cannot solve. It is the problem that sits underneath the whole story of Adam and Eve, and it goes like this. If God is all-powerful, if nothing happens that God does not cause, if nothing occurs against God's will, then how could Adam sin? Who is responsible for the first sin? If God controls everything, did God not, in some sense, cause the fall himself? This is not a foolish question. It is the question every thoughtful believer eventually arrives at, alone, usually late at night. Blijenbergh could not get past it, and he wrote to Spinoza because he had read Spinoza's work and sensed, correctly, that here was a mind that would not flinch from it. Now, who was the man he was writing to? Amsterdam, born 1632, a Jewish family that had fled the Portuguese Inquisition. At 23, his own community had cursed him with the cherem, the harshest excommunication in Jewish law, in part for questioning the immortality of the soul and the literal afterlife that everyone around him took for granted. He ground lenses for a living. He wrote in Latin. He had walked away from his entire world rather than affirm things he had read too carefully to believe. So Blijenbergh, the anxious believer, had written to perhaps the one man in Europe least likely to comfort him with the usual answers. And Spinoza wrote back. What followed was a correspondence that started polite, grew tense, and ended in a rupture, because Spinoza's answer, when it finally came, did not solve Blijenbergh's problem. It dissolved the thing the problem was made of. Here's the kicker. What Blijenbergh didn't know, opening that first letter, was that Spinoza was about to prove the sin he'd spent his life fearing had never actually happened. The crime had no scene, no victim, no weapon. Spinoza didn't need theology. He just needed someone to read the story honestly. But before he gave that answer, the text itself had to be looked at. And the first thing an honest look reveals is the threat that never came true. Genesis, chapter 2. God places Adam in the garden, points to one tree, and attaches a consequence stated as plainly as language allows. In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. In the day. Not eventually. Not someday. Not in a sense theologians would explain a few thousand years later. That day. Adam eats. And in chapter 5, the same book tells us Adam lived to 930. Read literally, that leaves us with three deeply uncomfortable possibilities. Either God said something that did not happen, or the consequence meant something other than what the words say. Or, And this is the one the story keeps pointing back toward. It was never meant to be read as a factual record in the first place. It is a myth, a narrative written by human beings to say something about the human condition, and asking it to be historically consistent is asking the wrong thing of it entirely. Brilliant minds have spent centuries explaining why die does not mean die, that Adam died spiritually, that he became mortal, that the dying began that day. Maybe. But notice what every one of those readings is doing, working very hard to keep a story standing that the story's own words knock over. And here is what that costs. Once you grant that the first consequence is not literal, the literal fall starts to wobble with it. If "you will die that day" is symbolic, why is "sin entered the world through one man" literal history? Why does one line get read as poetry and the next as a courtroom transcript? This is the first crack, and it only weakens the story. It doesn't yet touch the God inside it. But the next thing an honest reading finds does exactly that. So the first contradiction loosens the ground. The story may not be history, which means Blijenbergh's God, the one who controls every event, may not be doing what Blijenbergh thinks he's doing in this text at all, because of who that God turns out to be when you read the next scene. After they eat, Adam and Eve hide, and God comes walking through the garden in the cool of the day and calls out to the man. And what God says is a question. Where are you? Where are you? Read without the theology that came later. That sounds remarkably like a genuine question, the question of someone who does not already know the answer. The being who, in the doctrine you were taught, knows every sparrow that falls and every thought before you think it, is walking through a garden, calling out, trying to find two people behind a bush. Not exactly the behavior later theology would associate with an all-knowing God. And it keeps going. Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree? Read in their own context, these land like real questions, someone gathering information he does not yet have. This is an older God than the one the doctrine describes, a God who walks, who searches, who asks, who can be hidden from. A character in a story, written by people who imagined the divine in the only shape they had. Their own. Walking. Asking. Uncertain. Spinoza saw this with total clarity, and it is the thread that, once pulled, unravels everything. The God of the garden is not the infinite, all-knowing God of the philosophers. He is a human projection, the divine drawn at human scale, and a doctrine of eternal guilt built on the words of a projected, uncertain, searching God is built on sand. So now the second crack. The first weakened the story. This one weakens the God inside it. And with both of those loose, we arrive at the scene that does the most damage of all, the one that does not just weaken the guilt, but makes it impossible. Look again at the name of the tree. It is not just any tree, it is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Read that name slowly, because everything turns on it. The tree is the source of moral knowledge. The ability to tell right from wrong is precisely what eating from it gives. That is its entire function in the story, which means that at the moment God gives the command, "Do not eat," Adam and Eve do not yet possess the knowledge of good and evil. They cannot. The very faculty that would let them understand that disobeying is wrong is locked inside the fruit they have not yet touched. So they are punished, and through them, every human being ever born, forever, for a choice they made before they had the moral knowledge to understand that the choice was wrong. Think about what that would mean anywhere else. We do not hold a small child morally responsible the way we hold an adult, precisely because the child does not yet fully grasp right and wrong. Our entire sense of justice rests on the idea that guilt requires understanding. You cannot be guilty of a moral crime you lacked the capacity to recognize as one. And yet original sin asks you to accept that two people without the knowledge of good and evil committed the founding moral crime of the species, and that you inherited the stain of it at birth, before you had done anything at all. And here is where it stops being abstract. If the first humans could not be truly guilty for an act they could not morally understand, then the guilt handed to you as a child, guilt for their act, was built on a foundation that doesn't hold. The shame you carried was real. What it rested on wasn't. This is the knot Blijenbergh kept pulling at, in letter after letter. How can this be just? How can this be Adam's fault? How can a good God hold anyone to this? And Spinoza's answer, when it came, did not tighten the knot or loosen it. He cut it. Here is what Spinoza actually wrote to Blijenbergh in 1665. Not a paraphrase someone invented. His own argument, from the surviving letters, which you can read today. Blijenbergh kept treating God's command as a moral law, a rule issued by a ruler, which Adam then broke, committing a crime that brought evil into the world. And Spinoza, patiently, told him he had misunderstood what the command even was. In Spinoza's words, the prohibition to Adam consisted simply in this, that God revealed to Adam that eating from the tree caused death, in the very same way that nature reveals to us that poison is deadly. Read that again, because it changes everything. Do not eat, or you will die, is not a king laying down a law that can be loyally obeyed or wickedly broken. It is reality stating a fact. It belongs to the same category as this poison will kill you. It describes a consequence built into the nature of things. It is not a test of obedience. It is not a trap. It is information. And if the command was a statement of fact, rather than a moral law, then eating the fruit was not a betrayal of God. It was a mistake about reality, like a person who swallows poison without understanding what it is. There is harm in that. There is consequence. But there is no cosmic crime. There is no rebellion. There is no stain that travels down through every human being ever born. This is the move that makes Spinoza dangerous, and it is so quiet you could miss it. He did not argue that Adam was innocent of the crime. He removed the crime. He looked at the puzzle of Adam's guilt that had tormented Blijenbergh for months, and he did not solve it. He dissolved it. But Spinoza was not finished, because Blijenbergh kept insisting on one more thing, that Adam's act was a positive evil, a real substance of sin that entered the world. And it is here that Spinoza removes the last possibility of inheriting anything at all. Spinoza tells Blijenbergh, in plain terms, that evil is not a positive thing. It is a privation, an absence, a lack, the missing of a more perfect state. This sounds abstract. It is the hinge the whole doctrine turns on, so hold on to it. When we call something evil, Spinoza argues, we are not pointing to a real thing that exists in the world. We are pointing to an absence, the way darkness is not a substance, but the absence of light, the way cold is not a thing, but the absence of heat. There is no dark stuff, there is no cold stuff, and there is no sin stuff. Adam's act, Spinoza writes, was a privation, the loss of a more perfect state. And here is the blow. A privation cannot be inherited like a substance. You cannot pass down an absence the way you pass down a debt. Nothing positive was created in that garden that could travel, generation to generation, into the blood of every child ever born. The entire doctrine of original sin depends on sin being a thing, a stain, a mark, a corruption passed from Adam to you across thousands of years. Spinoza removes the thing, and once there is no thing, there is nothing to inherit. The chain that supposedly binds your guilt to a garden you never saw has no first link. It was never there. Now, you might expect Blijenbergh, who had written in such anguish looking for an answer, to feel relief. He did not. As the letters go on, he grows defensive, then offended, because he could see what Spinoza's answer destroyed. If sin is not a substance, if Adam committed no crime against the cosmos, if nothing was inherited, then the fall is gone, and with it, the entire scaffolding of guilt and salvation he had built his life upon. And he could not pay that price. So he broke it off. The correspondence ended, not in agreement, but in a believer backing away from a door he had opened himself. People rarely thank you for taking away a fear they have organized their whole life around. But the letters survived him, and the argument inside them is exactly as sharp today as it was 3.5 centuries ago, when a grain merchant could not sleep, and a lens grinder told him the truth he could not bear to keep. So if Adam wasn't guilty, and the stain cannot be inherited, and the command wasn't a law, what are you left with? Not an answer. Not yet. Just a silence where the guilt used to be, and Spinoza knew that silence would feel like falling, but he also knew what came after it. So if you were never born guilty, what were you born as? This is the part the demolition never reaches, and it is the part that matters most. Tearing down original sin is only half the work. The other half is what stands in its place. And Spinoza put something there. A human being, he argues, is not a fallen creature exiled from a garden, dragging a stain. A human being is a finite expression of nature itself, a part of the infinite, with the capacity to understand, to act, to grow in power and in joy. You were not born broken. You were born unfinished, like everything else in nature, with your whole life ahead of you to become more fully what you are. And the aim of a life, for Spinoza, is not to atone for a crime you did not commit. It is to understand. The more clearly you grasp the causes of things, of your fear, your desire, your sadness, your joy, the freer you become, and the more your power to live expands. The freedom from guilt is not a gift you wait for after death. It is what happens, here and now, the moment you see clearly that the guilt was never grounded in anything real. He puts it in a single line, near the very end of the Ethics. Blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. You do not understand the world in order to earn salvation later. The understanding is the salvation. There is no garden to climb back into, because you were never expelled from one. You were always exactly where you are now, a part of nature, capable of understanding, free to the precise degree that you understand. Spinoza died at 44, his lungs ruined by 2 decades of glass dust, buried in an unmarked grave because no community would claim him. He never founded a church. He never asked anyone to believe him. He asked only that people read carefully, think clearly, and refuse to be afraid of what they found. Blijenbergh went back to his faith and his grain. The letters were published after Spinoza's death, and slowly, over centuries, the argument inside them did its quiet work, until the reading of Genesis as myth rather than history became, in serious scholarship, simply the ordinary view. The believer lost his nerve. The idea outlived them both. And what that idea says is this: Adam and Eve is a beautiful story, a profound one, a myth about the loss of innocence, the strange grief of knowing too much, the ache of growing up. As a mirror held to the human condition, it is one of the great stories of our species. But it was never a courtroom. It was never the record of a crime you inherited. It was never proof that you arrived in this world already owing a debt. People took a myth about being human and turned it into a verdict on you, and a person who believes they were born guilty will spend a whole life trying to pay off a debt that was never real, to creditors who were always only human. So the next time the old guilt rises, at 3 a.m, at a family table, in the quiet when no one is watching, remember how Spinoza read it. The threat that started it all never came true. The God who walked there did not know where Adam was hiding. 2 people without the knowledge of good and evil could not have committed the crime you were billed for. And sin, it turns out, is not a substance that anyone can hand down. The garden was always a mirror. It was never a verdict. You can put it down now. It was never yours to carry.